Hi there, my name is Kara Earhart, and I'm the Justice Ministries Program Assistant with the Presbyterian Church. When the Presbyterian Church in Canada made its confession, we acknowledged the harm we caused in operating residential schools and committed to seeking ways to walk with Indigenous people towards healing and wholeness. 2019 marks the 25th anniversary of the first time we made our confession. As we look back on the past 25 years, and the longer history of the Church's relationship with Indigenous peoples in this country, we continue to seek ways to live out the spirit of the confession and the Church's commitment to reconciliation. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission issued 94 calls to action to deal with the legacy of harm caused in and through residential schools. 10 of the calls to action are directed to us as churches. Call to Action 49 asks the Church to repudiate concepts used to justify European superiority over Indigenous peoples. This includes two concepts, known as the Doctrine of Discovery and Terra Nullius. What do we mean by the Doctrine of Discovery? The Doctrine of Discovery was developed in the Middle Ages through a series of decrees from the Church that legitimized European monarchs' colonial efforts to subjugate non-Christians and seize their land across the globe. A translation of one such statement in 1452 granted the King of Portugal full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ wherever they may be, as well as their kingdoms and other property, and to reduce their persons into perpetual servitude. Terra Nullius is a related legal concept that is Latin for empty land, or land belonging to no one. Land was treated as terra nullius if it was deemed unoccupied or unowned. Specifically, this often was assumed to mean unfarmed by European standards. The Doctrine of Discovery as a religious and legal principle emerged in times when church law and state law were deeply connected. The attitudes that underline it have thus shaped the colonial relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada for hundreds of years. The effects of the actions rooted in the Doctrine of Discovery and concepts like terra nullius that you will hear about in this video are truly devastating. You will hear sections from letters or reports read out as direct quotations that show a stark lack of empathy for Indigenous people. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission described the residential school system as cultural genocide. A hard and complicated truth is that the Presbyterian Church in Canada was an agent in that system, and so as we confront this truth, we must bear witness to its ongoing legacy and seek ways towards healing. At General Assembly in June 2019, commissioners will vote on a series of recommendations related to repudiating the Doctrine of Discovery. In order to understand where in our history and policies the Church relied on concepts that justify European sovereignty over Indigenous lands and peoples, the Presbyterian Church in Canada's Assistant Archivist, Bob Anger, researched and prepared a narrative chronology reflecting how some of these attitudes manifested in the Church. This window of time reflects the beginning of the Presbyterian Church in Canada until the year that the Government of Canada took on the operation of the last Presbyterian residential schools. The pressing question is, how has the Presbyterian Church in Canada's mission and ministry with Indigenous peoples been affected, if not directly by the Doctrine of Discovery, then by the assumption that Europeans knew better than Indigenous peoples what was needed to thrive in life? This video is a summary of Bob's research. The actions and policies described in this video created trauma for generations of Indigenous people, trauma that is still an active influence on daily lives and relationships. The Doctrine of Discovery was one of the tools used to shape this intergenerational trauma. In order to continue the work of undoing this trauma, we must understand and repudiate the doctrine in our church, not only in its historical use, but also any present legacy. We are working to ensure that Presbyterians and others know about concepts like terra nullius and the Doctrine of Discovery, so that the attitudes growing from these concepts can be identified and changed. Doctrines that espouse superiority of one people or culture over another must never again be allowed to take root. Thanks for joining us to learn about this important research and the effects of this devastating history. For more information, feel free to contact us at Justice Ministries at any time.
Justice Ministries asked if we could look through the Acts and Proceedings and Women's Missionary Society annual reports and any other applicable sources we knew of in order to find instances where the Church did these. 1. Consciously presumed the superiority of European culture, language, traditions, religions, etc. over Indigenous culture. 2. Consciously described Indigenous people and culture as inferior. 3. Expressed the views that assimilation into European or Western culture is the only way to be Christ-like. And 4, believed that the success of mission was understood by the degree to which Indigenous people were civilized. In other words, quotes that reflect a colonial attitude by the Church. But also, any instances where the above attitudes were questioned. The end product is 52 pages of quotes covering roughly 100 years. The quotes begin in 1866, the year the Church first entered into mission work with Indigenous people, and end in 1969, when the Church handed over responsibility of its 2 remaining residential schools to the government. It's a long time, and to try to give some context to the quotes, rather than having just one long list, I ended up grouping them into smaller time periods or sections, based on points in time where things seemed to change in some way, and then wrote short introductory histories for each of the sections as well. So, for this presentation, what I'd like to do is just go over each of these sections from the report by giving you a bit of the history, and more importantly, highlighting some of the quotes themselves from the report. And a short disclaimer, I've tried to be as accurate as possible, but distilling 100 years of history into a few pages is not easy, and you inevitably end up simplifying things that are very complex and making broad generalized statements about things that are much more nuanced than that. So I just ask you to keep that in mind. The report itself is not meant to be a full or official history in any way, but rather as a source of reference, specifically for Justice Ministries, but also hopefully for the wider Church. So with that in mind, I'll begin. Section 1, 1866. It was in this year that Presbyterians in what is now Canada first entered into mission work with Indigenous people. The minister who volunteered to take on the responsibility was Reverend James Nisbet, and in June of 1866, he and his wife and baby daughter and a small party of helpers left what is now Winnipeg and traveled 900 kilometers out into the prairies with the expectation of founding a mission somewhere in the area around what is today northern Saskatchewan. The party arrived 39 days later at Fort Carleton, a Hudson's Bay Company trading post on the North Saskatchewan River, where they met George Flett, Nisbet's interpreter. In general, Nisbet approached the task of securing a location for the mission with what appears to be a mix of both colonialism and respect. The following is a quote from Nisbet just after his arrival at Fort Carleton, which sheds light on the colonial aspect of his thinking.
James Nisbet, July 18th, 1866. Our plan must be to pitch upon a place eligible for settlement, and when the Indians are disposed to leave their children for instruction, one place will suit them just as well as another, considering that they were very seldom to be found on what they call their own lands.
Nisbet himself added the italics. However, in his actual dealings with the local Indigenous leaders, Nisbet, with Flett's help, seems to have exhibited a measure of respect. He acknowledged the territory on which he wanted to stay belonged to the Cree Nation, and like a visitor or outsider, expressed a desire to stay only where invited and welcomed first. The following are 2 quotes from a letter written by Nisbet about these first meetings.
James Nisbet, July 30th, 1866. Mr. Flett and I sat down among them, and as a preliminary to conversation, according to Indian fashion, we gave to each a bit of tobacco. After the whole company had their pipes in full blast, I made a little speech to them. Mr. Flett added a few words telling them the places he had visited and how he had been received, and that he came here because none of the people at the other places had invited us to live among them, although they would not hinder us, that we did not wish to go where we were not desired, that some of their people had invited us to come and live here, naming the persons, that we had accepted the invitation, and he hoped that they would allow us to live quietly among them, and that, if they were so inclined, they would wait upon our instructions, and that we would gladly teach them any useful thing that we know. Another of the old men gave quite a long speech. He said he quite agreed with the others. He liked our talk very much. He thought we were kind, and he hoped we would live peaceably together and help one another. Nevertheless, he must say a few words. Then he spoke of the white men coming into their territory, driving away their buffalo, so that they are now few and confined to a small space, that the Indians were driven farther and farther away as the white man advanced, so that they were now in narrow bounds, etc. In reply to his long speech, we said that all he said about the white man was perfectly true, and that was one reason why the friends in Canada had sent us to teach them a better way of living than to depend altogether on the buffalo, and that they may learn other things whereby they may be blessed forever.
Section 2, 1867 to 1874. This is the time period in which James Nisbet's mission existed. His was the only mission the church had with Indigenous people during this time, and it ends when he and his wife both died from exhaustion and disease, essentially giving their lives for the work. It was a period, too, of enormous change for Indigenous people on the prairies. Settlers were arriving in increasing numbers, the buffalo were being pushed further west, smallpox and other diseases were wreaking havoc on them, and most significantly in 1870, the ancestral land on which they lived was, quote, sold by the Hudson's Bay Company to the Canadian government, causing a large degree of anxiety amongst them. Now Nisbet himself was born in Scotland and certainly had what we would call today a colonial attitude towards Indigenous culture and religion. And sadly, some of his quotes exhibit this attitude very clearly. However, I suggest in the report that his actual approach to the mission work was in some ways different from the approach the church would take later on. It was an approach that seemed to focus more on the sharing of Christianity and Euro-Canadian culture with those willing, rather than that of forcing it upon everyone, as would indeed happen in the future. What I'd like to show next is a very long, but I think interesting quote that sheds light on this. It dates from 1868. During that year, Nisbet and his family had returned to Ontario for a time, and when he returned to the mission, things seemed to have fallen apart a little, and the local Indigenous people asked for a gathering. The following is Nisbet's recounting of that meeting.
James Nesbit, September 29th, 1868. Dinner discussed, and the pipe of peace lighted, I said to them that I had been told that there were some among them who wished to speak to us about some things connected with the mission, and I had invited them all to come, that all might hear what is said, and that each one might have an opportunity of saying what he pleased. That we are here to do as much good as we can to as many Indians as we can, and we shall be glad to hear what they have to say, that we may be directed how to act. For 5 long hours, we were listening to the Indian speeches of more or less merit. All the speakers acknowledged the superiority of the white man. None of them would say anything against his religion. Perhaps it would yet become the religion of the whole of them. But as white men encroached on their country, their means of living became less, and the white men must teach them how to live otherwise than by the chase, and help them to do so. Who could they look to but the minister to teach and help them? He was sent to do good to the Indians, and the great book out of which he reads teaches to be kind to the poor. They all agreed in saying that they see no hope for them but in farming. But how can they farm who have never been taught and have no tools? They look to the minister to teach and be kind to their children and grandchildren. They put them under his care. They did not want foreigners to come and crowd them out of their land, but they had no objection to the minister and his people staying among them. I made a general reply to all that was said. I repeated all that I had said to them when we first came here, our great object in coming, to teach the Christian religion. But the people who sent us know that the wild animals are becoming scarce, and they are willing that we should teach such as wish to become farmers and help them at the first to plow, and lend them oxen to haul fencing and logs for houses, and show them how to put them up. I explained to them fully how they should proceed in the event of any of them wishing to make a trial of farming next season. I said I would be glad to do all in my power for their children, and would teach any of them, young or old, to read and write in their own language who desired it. I trust and pray that good will come of this conference. Some predicted trouble, but I do not apprehend any. I found a great deal more of the conciliatory spirit than I expected, and more appreciation of our work than I thought existed, and I thank God for it.
It's an extraordinary letter with a lot to digest. I'll just highlight a couple things. One, it shows an interest in listening and learning by Nisbet, which I think it is safe to say the church did not do in later years. And two, it shows that Nisbet's first focus was to share the Christian message, not to, quote, civilize, but that he was willing to help those that wanted to change, both in terms of learning how to farm and in learning how to read and write, and most notably in their own language. It's a very different approach from what the church would later take as it began to operate residential schools. Section 3, 1875 to 1883. After the Nisbets' deaths in 1874, the work was expanded slightly. Unlike Nisbet, however, nearly all of the new missionaries appointed, two of them being John Mackay and George Flett, had some Indigenous ancestry themselves and a strong knowledge and understanding of Indigenous language and culture. And from the perspective of simply spreading the Christian message, these missionaries seem to have had some success. The following is a quote from the Foreign Missions Committee report to the Assembly in 1882. The Foreign Missions Committee is the predecessor of what is today the International Ministries Department within the Life and Mission Agency, and was the committee responsible for overseeing mission work with Indigenous people. The quote gives an example of the work of John Mackay, who had been Nisbet's interpreter, and was later ordained to the ministry by the Presbytery of Manitoba. In 1880, Chief Mistawasis requested he be appointed missionary to his reserve, and he became the first missionary at Mistawasis.
Foreign Missions Committee Report, 1882. When he arrived, he found that few of the Indians from the prairies could read or write the syllabic character, having forgotten what they had learned at Prince Albert before they removed to their reserve. Mr. Mackay began at once to teach them, and at the end of 6 months he was able to report that in almost every house the heads of families can read and write with ease in their own language. The parents are now also teaching their children, and thus soon the entire population will have a ready access to the Word of God in their own tongue. Mr. Mackay conducts divine service twice every Lord's Day and holds a prayer meeting on Wednesday evenings. In winter, the congregation ranges from 60 to 100. The services have, during the winter, been held in Mr. Mackay's house, as there is neither church nor schoolhouse in which the people can meet.
It's a fascinating quote, showing the success of an approach focused on teaching reading and writing in the Cree language to adults, who could then teach it to their own children. Essentially the polar opposite of the rhetoric used just a few years later to establish the residential schools by saying the children were the only hope and needed to be removed from the parents. Section 4, 1884 to 1889. In this time period, the church rapidly expanded its mission work with Indigenous people. In 1884, the church had just 5 individuals employed in the work at these places. 5 years later, in 1889, it had 23, and almost all of these new missionaries and teachers were Euro-Canadian, with little or no real familiarity with Indigenous language or culture. The work being done by earlier missionaries like John Mackay and George Flett up to this point, as reflected in the quote just read, seems to have been conducted in a more or less peer-to-peer or adult-to-adult style of relationship. With the passing of the Indian Act in 1876, however, Indigenous people became wards of the government, and sadly, the government, church, and most of Canadian society after this point began to view the relationship as more of an adult-to-child one, much to the detriment of Indigenous people. The fact that some rose up in a short but violent uprising called the Northwest Rebellion in 1885, unfortunately, seems to have further exacerbated the view by most Canadians and the Church that Indigenous people needed to be, quote, civilized. The following is a quote from the Acts and Proceedings of 1885.
Foreign Missions Committee Report, 1885. Your committee believe that, in the sad events which we now deplore, the Lord is calling us to greater diligence and greater fidelity in imparting to those poor benighted tribes the knowledge which alone can lead them in the way of peace and everlasting life.
It's maybe no surprise, therefore, that this is also the time period when the Church's work in residential schools began. There were a number of early advocates within the Presbyterian Church in Canada that supported the idea of residential schools, one of them being George Flett. However, the leading spokesperson for the concept was arguably the Reverend Hugh Mackay, a minister from Ontario with no relation to John Mackay noted earlier, who had been appointed as a missionary at Round Lake, Saskatchewan in 1883. At the beginning of this talk, I noted that the impetus for this research was Justice Ministry's desire to know of any quotes from the Acts and Proceedings which consciously presumed the superiority of European culture, language, traditions, religion, etc., over Indigenous culture. The following, which is from the Foreign Missions Committee report of 1886, is, I think, a stark example.
Foreign Missions Committee Report, 1886. In closing the report of Reverend Hugh Mackay's school, Mr. Mackay says, "We have been much encouraged in our experiment of a school in which poor Indian children are both boarded and taught during the past 2 winters. And we feel that we can recommend a school of this kind on a large scale to the sympathy of the Church. We have read of asylums for dogs and cats, and the work is spoken of as a work of mercy. Are not these little children better than they? Is it a work to be despised to take these little ones and lift them up from the poverty and filth and paganism in which we find them to become useful citizens of our country and sharers with us of the bright hope of a better life beyond? We think schools of this kind should be established in many places, schools in which the children could be kept, fed, clothed, and educated. They would thus be under our control and away from the pernicious influence of the pagan. If this plan were adopted, we feel assured that in a few years, instead of wandering pagans, we should have industrious and happy communities and many true Christians."
Then, at the Synod meeting that same year in 1886, the following resolutions were passed.
Synod of Manitoba and the Northwest Minutes, May 20th, 1886. Mr. James Robertson moved the following resolution, which was seconded by Mr. James C. Quinn and adopted, that in order to remedy existing defects and evils, it is desirable that schools be established at which the children may be boarded and so removed from the injurious influences of their home life. The Synod gratefully recognizes the work already being done by the government in connection with the education of the Indians, that the Synod is of opinion more industrial schools should be established in central localities for advanced pupils, and that pupils might be drafted into such schools from more elementary schools, that the Synod press this matter upon the attention of the government.
It shows the Church was very much involved in residential schools right from the beginning, a willing and at times leading partner with the government. One of the saddest ironies I noticed in doing this research is that, as mentioned earlier, the mission work being done on the reserves was in many respects doing well at this very time, from a sharing Christianity viewpoint. Christian communities were not only being formed, but in many respects being embraced by Indigenous peoples. and yet it is this very time when the argument used for starting residential schools is that the children needed to be removed from their, quote, pagan homes. The following is a quote regarding the Birdtail Reserve.
Foreign Missions Committee Report, 1887. This band presents, in some respects, one of the most striking instances of progress shown by any of our bands. They are Sioux. As reported last year, this is to a large extent a Christian community. There are about 140 souls on the reserve, and there are 30 names on the communion roll. They have prayer meetings, Sunday schools, and family worship, and contribute to church schemes. Our school on this reserve, under Mr. J. G. Burgess, is doing excellent work. The number on the roll is 27, with an average of a little over half that number.
Just 1 year later, this day school was closed, and the parents in this Christian community had to send their children 12 miles away to the new Birdle Residential School. And they would have to do that for the next roughly 70 years. The doctrine of discovery essentially refers to the attitudes of superiority and arrogance used by European powers to justify the taking of Indigenous peoples' land. Sadly, the same attitudes were now being used to justify the taking of their children. Section 5, 1890 to 1911. Although some day schools on reserves continued, the focus was now on boarding schools, still relatively small at this time, with about 20 to 30 children on average. However, in 1890, the Presbyterian Church, along with the government, opened the Regina Industrial School, which took the boarding school model to a new level with a capacity of over 100 children. The aim of this new, larger industrial school was to take in only older children and train them in various technical skills and trades, as well as classroom work. Very quickly, the industrial boarding school system began costing the government a lot of money. As a result, the system of financing the schools was changed in 1893 from one where the government simply paid the expenses to one in which they provided a per capita grant to the church based on the numbers of pupils enrolled in the school. It was a system that never seems to have worked and was a major factor in the closure of the Regina Industrial School in 1910, and yet it continued to be the method of funding for residential schools for decades. I would say that it is during this 1890 to 1911 time period that some of the most disheartening quotes by the church can be found.
Foreign Missions Committee Report, 1895. This mission, File Hills School, is still under the management of Mr. and Mrs. Alex Skeen. From the beginning, they have aimed at separating the children as much as possible from their old heathen surroundings, and there are now in the school boys who have not been absent from it for a single night for nearly 3 years.
Although only first proposed in 1886, the church quickly embraced the idea of the residential schools, and by 1890 had opened 7 of them. Most of these were in the prairies, but soon 2 more would be opened in British Columbia. Sadly, in embracing residential schools over day schools on each reserve, the church never seemed to listen in any way to the wishes of the Indigenous people themselves, who for the most part were not necessarily against education, but against sending their kids away. Here are 2 quotes, one from the 1892 Acts and Proceedings and the other from 1893, that speak to this.
Foreign Missions Committee Report, 1892. There are over 20 children of school age there on the reserve, attending no school. The only reason they give is that their children are too small to leave home, and they wish to have a school on their own reserve so that they may see their children often. Foreign Missions Committee Report, 1893. The people are wishing to get a school on the reserve. They do not want to send their children away from home.
As a result, attendance at residential schools was in fact quite poor in these early years, which became a real problem for the church, as funding from the government was based on the number of children in actual attendance. Unfortunately, the church tended to blame the parents for the lack of attendance, rather than recognize that it was the residential aspect of the school itself which was a primary problem. As a result, more and more time and energy, and sadly pressure tactics, were used in attempts to, quote, recruit children. And when these continued to be unsuccessful, the idea of compulsory education began to be raised.
Foreign Missions Committee Report, 1893. The most important change is the proposal to adopt a system of compulsory education. Hitherto, pressure of many kinds has been brought to bear upon chiefs of bands and upon parents to send their children to school. Moral suasion has been employed. Rations have been withheld from those who refused, and they have been deprived of some of the favors which it is in the power of the officers of the Indian Department to give.
Aside from the difficulties of the residential schools, Indigenous people in this time period were also having to come to grips with the complete loss of their land. Up to 1890, immigration into the prairies had increased, but was still relatively small, with roughly 43,000 settlers on the land. By 1911, there were 1.3 million. Indigenous people on the prairies, therefore, quickly became a marginalized minority, located on small reserves and crowded out of what had until recently been their land. To the Canadian government and the churches assisting in the work, they became a burden, and the cost of the promises made in order to take the land now sadly became a nuisance, which further cemented the idea that Indigenous people needed to be assimilated. And here are two quotes from the 1890 Acts and Proceedings which reflect this.
Foreign Missions Committee Report, 1890. The expense to the country of the Indians is increasing every year and is already a very formidable sum.
And this next one, which is particularly disturbing.
The only hope of the Indian race is that it should be finally merged in the life of the country. We cannot afford to perpetuate separate nationalities and separate languages within our borders. Our nation, if it is to be a nation at all, must be homogeneous.
Section 6 and 7, 1912 to 1969. From an administration standpoint, significant changes happened at the beginning of this time period regarding the Church's mission work with Indigenous people. In 1912, oversight of the mission work was moved from the Foreign Missions Committee to the Home Missions Committee, what is today Canadian Ministries within the Life and Mission Agency. Then, in 1914, an agreement was reached between the Church and the government, whereby the government maintained responsibility for the day schools that existed. The Women's Missionary Society became responsible for the administration of the residential schools, and the Home Missions Committee became responsible simply for the work on the reserves. This all had a huge impact on the work in many ways. For one, the work on the reserves suffered tremendously. Resources and support dwindled substantially, especially after Church Union in 1925, and some were left without a missionary. Sadly, just at the time when many of the reserves, even with the detrimental effects of the residential schools, had developed Christian communities. One example of this was at Mistawasis, where John Mackay had been the longtime missionary. For roughly 10 years, from 1918 until 1928, it was left vacant, with no missionary or minister to serve the people. I think it says something about John Mackay's influence and approach that despite this vacancy, and despite having to send their older children to residential schools, a Christian community continued and indeed still continues. As for the residential schools, once under the responsibility of the Women's Missionary Society, the visibility of the work seems to have increased. However, at the beginning of this time period, 1912, attendance and therefore finances continued to be a problem for some schools, and efforts to bring in children called, quote, recruiting became more pervasive. Here are two short quotes from 1916 regarding Birtle, which indicates it was struggling.
Women's Missionary Society Report, 1916. If the difficulties of recruiting could be overcome, We believe that Birtle would more than hold its own.
Board of Home Missions Report, 1916. The Birtle School, enlarged 3 years ago, has been passing through a trying period of its history. The staff has been efficient, but the attendance has been too low for satisfactory finance.
Further study, I think, should be done on this issue, but from what I glimpsed, it could have been a rare point in time when the residential schools could have been discontinued. Some of them were suffering financially, and in one case within the Presbyterian Church, at the Crowstand Reserve, the residential school was discontinued and a day school placed back on the reserve. And here's a quote from the 1916 Acts and Proceedings reflecting this change.
Board of Home Missions Report, 1916. Whether this experiment will prove more efficient than the old method remains to be seen, but the difficulty of getting a sufficient number of children for the boarding school made it imperative that some change be made.
Sadly, rather than recognize the real problem that Indigenous people did not want to send their kids away, the church and government focused instead on forcing them to do so. And in 1920, compulsory education became fully enforced.
Board of Home Missions Report, 1921. A new regulation of the Indian Department which came into force last year requires the enforcement of compulsory education of Indian children. Our schools are all overcrowded.
Women's Missionary Society Report, 1921. Attendance at all the schools has greatly improved. Compulsory school laws enforced by the government are proving a benefit.
With attendance increasing substantially, all of the schools needed to be enlarged. Health conditions within the residential schools were always bad, but in the early 1900s, things seemed to have gotten worse, both in the schools and on the reserves. Increased contact between growing settler populations near the reserves and increased attendance in the confined spaces of our residential schools seemed to have had a terrible impact, with tuberculosis being especially rampant. And here are two quotes regarding this.
Women's Missionary Society Report, 1917. The health of the pupils and adults has been exceptionally good. The death rate is decreasing each year at Round Lake Boarding School. Women's Missionary Society Report, 1941. Miss Carruthers, a nurse at Cecilia Jeffrey, has had a busy year. Flu, 37 children, mumps, 106, scabies, 40, pneumonia, 2, tuberculosis, an average per month of 13, transfer to the sanatorium, 7, deaths, 2, general diseases, 70, accidents, 3, operations, 3, deaths, 1, miscellaneous doctor's visits, 5, and a complete X-ray in October.
However, this was also the time period when some within the church started to question aspects of the residential schools system. In a report to the Presbytery of Regina in 1923, Reverend R.B. Heron, former principal of the Regina Industrial School, was critical of the quality of education provided to children in residential schools and the lack of voice given to Indigenous parents in the system. He was encouraged to write an article in the Presbyterian Witness, a weekly magazine, but nothing substantial seems to have come from it. The following is a quote from the Women's Missionary Society Annual Report for 1932, which, although not exactly critical, does at least show the beginnings of some empathy.
Women's Missionary Society Report, 1932. May we also say a word reminding ourselves that these Indian parents deny themselves much in being separated from their boys and girls, except for 6 weeks in the summer. We realize our stewardship and responsibility.
And another quote from 1948, which shows the tiniest beginnings of some change.
General Board of Mission Report, 1948. Our school-age children are all at the Indian Residential School at Birtle, Manitoba. This year, they were allowed home for Christmas holidays. Everybody enjoyed these days very much indeed. It was the first time our Indian people had their families home at Christmas time.
Then, in 1960, the Board of Evangelism and Social Action, predecessor to Justice Ministries today, in its report to the General Assembly, commented at length on an address made by Senator James Gladstone, the first Indigenous senator to be appointed, in which he outlined the government's poor record with respect to its relationship with Indigenous people.
The Board of Evangelism and Social Action Report, 1960. It is the conviction of your board that the Assembly ought to accept the invitation of Senator Gladstone and lend our voice to his.
The board then quoted at length parts of a letter written by the senator to the church. The following is one part.
Senator Gladstone, as far as the churches are concerned, I believe they still have a big job to do. However, I feel they should try to put education and religion on the same footing as it is in the non-Indian communities around the reserve. This would mean the abolition of residential schools and limiting of missionaries under the work of religious instruction, church services, etc.
It was at this time as well, in 1960, that the Presbyterian Church in Canada prepared and submitted a brief to the Parliamentary Committee on Indian Affairs, in which a number of statements and recommendations for change were made. Here are just two.
Women's Missionary Society Brief to the Parliamentary Committee on Indian Affairs, 1960. As a norm, we think the day school near enough to the reserves of the pupils, which is shared alike by Indian and non-Indian, is the most acceptable. We disapprove of the practice of taking young children, and even some inexperienced older children, far away from their home reserve to a central school, even though it be a fine school. There must be a transition period, so that the shock of a complete change and the shock of an overwhelming homesickness will not accrue either to the pupil or to his parents and family. Incompatibility and loneliness are often discounted by staff. These are major problems, often leading to withdrawal from schools.
Just for some context, the church wrote this 6 years before Chani Wenjack ran away from the Cecilia Jeffrey School. The brief itself, however, seems to focus on how the government should change and didn't in any large degree analyze how the church should or could change. And it still recommended the continuance of the residential schools. But as evidenced by these quotes, there was some dawning recognition that things as they stood were not working well. And I'll finish with one last quote from the brief that finally shows a less colonial, Euro-Canadian superiority on the part of the church when it comes to Indigenous culture.
With scholarships, Canada Foundation or other special funds, selected Indians should be encouraged to gather and put into forms which can be preserved histories of tribes, their customs, their lore, their artistry, their language, and other marks of their culture, all of which would return to the Indian some of the dignity of which he was shorn by those processes of the government and relationships with non-Indians, which have tended to detract from the dignity of the people. This should be done while Indians, still living, can relate the present generation back to Indians of former generations, who live more or less according to their historic manner and custom. This would not only be a source of pride with the Indian, but would enrich the general culture of Canada, and would be the means of correcting histories written for non-Indian consumption with a severe bias against the Indian.
Things were beginning to change, therefore. It would, however, take a long time, as it was 34 long years between these initial statements in 1960 and the creation and adoption of the confession made by the Presbyterian Church to Indigenous people in 1994.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. There are links in the video description to resources where you can learn more about the doctrine of discovery. If you learned something in this video, share it with a member of your church and start a conversation. How can you seek reconciliation in your community?